Blood is a horror-themed FPS on the Build engine. It is in fact one of the big three Build engine games, these being Duke Nukem 3D, Blood, and Shadow Warrior. I say horror-themed because it's not an outright horror game. There are no survival elements and no jump scares. However, it has a fairly creepy atmosphere and music, enemies and levels that are clearly inspired by horror movies and games, and many other references to popular horror media of its time. But it is ultimately an action shooter much like Duke Nukem 3D. The story is fairly original for its time. It is ultimately a revenge tale, but one told from the perspective of an anti-hero who makes no illusion to being a good guy. You are Caleb, a gunslinger who is part of the cult of Chernobog, and a member of their elite team, the Chosen. Until one day, Chernobog decides that somehow you failed him and executes all of the Chosen. The game starts with you resurrecting years later and seeking revenge on the cult and Chernobog himself, and taking out anyone or anything that gets in your way. One of the strongest elements of this game would be the weapon selection, which really stands out for the time, and some of the weapons are still pretty unique today. Where practically every 90s shooter started you off with some sort of pistol, Blood starts you with either a sawed-off shotgun or flare gun. The flare gun fires a projectile which lodges into an enemy and causes them to burst into flames, which is very satisfying. Another particularly unique weapon, and one of my favourites, is the Voodoo Doll, which damages whatever enemy you're staring at when you stab it, or yourself if no enemies are present. Almost all guns have an alternative fire. For example, the double-barreled shotgun may fire individual barrels, or, alternatively, fire both at once. The flare gun might fire a flare that lodges in an enemy, or one that explodes on contact. Blood may very well be the first FPS to ever do this. The enemies are also pretty cool. Standard enemies consist of cultists and zombies, but you'll also be fighting gargoyles, ghosts, sentient severed hands, and more. Many enemies have multiple death animations, depending on the weapon used, such as bursting into flames, or zombies getting beheaded when killed with a pitchfork, or turning to dust if killed with the Voodoo Doll. End of episode bosses are fun enough to fight. Very straightforward, shoot the big thing until it dies. Nothing special, they serve their purpose without being all that memorable, but also not being overly frustrating to fight. Levels are also both aesthetically pleasing and well designed. Many of the levels are direct homages to horror movies, such as the not-so-subtly named levels Overlooked Hotel, which includes Of Frozen Johnny, and Crystal Lake, which also has a Jason mask. When I say well-designed, I mean to say that the levels generally flow nicely and make good use of their space. While there have been a couple of puzzles that had me stuck for a while, I rarely roamed the levels with absolutely no idea where to go next or what I was even looking for. And the few times that has happened, I realized it was mostly down to me missing something when I finally found a solution. Rarely, if ever, have I been annoyed at the game upon finding the way to progress. The difficulty does feel a bit unbalanced early on, with the cultists having hit-scan weapons before you get the right weapons to deal with them, but it evens out pretty nicely after the first couple of levels and maintains a decent consistent pace throughout. While streaming the game, I played using the Blood GDX source port, which allowed for modern resolutions and comes highly recommended. It does, however, fail to run the end-of-episode cutscenes, which usually consist of Caleb mourning a member of the Chosen and finishing off the boss in a gory fashion. During the stream, I just found the cutscenes on YouTube after every chapter. I chose to play the game on an easier difficulty as the hit-scan enemies were proving to be a bit of an annoyance. Combat ended up being pretty easy on this difficulty, but still satisfying throughout. I played the original 4 episodes, leaving out the expansion pack episodes, so the review only covers the original content. In conclusion, the game was fun, thematically very memorable with cool weapons and well-designed levels. Probably the best of the big 3 Build engine games and a confident recommendation from me.